Today we begin Alexander Pope's an essay on criticism. Even though it is called an essay, it is in verse. In the 18th century, a kind of practice of writing verse essays could be seen. This verse or this poem by Pope was ambitious in the sense that it was in the tradition of Horace's Ars Poetica and the French poet Boileau's Ars Poetique. Now you know that Horace's Ars Poetica, which laid down the rules of writing poetry, was very influential on all later writers. Similarly, the French neoclassical critic Boileau's poem Ars Poetique was also influential on all French neoclassical writers. So Pope's ambition was to write a poem that would lay down the rules of writing poetry and which would be similarly influential on contemporary poets and writers. But that exactly did not happen in England because the English writers were not used to follow a regimented kind of writing according to the disciplines of a school. So English poets were more individualistic. Like in France, they had an academy which had an enormous influence on the writers and poets. So that kind of organized or institutional control over literature did not happen in England. So Pope's influence on poetry was not to the extent that he wanted it to be. However, this poem has many memorable lines, and we still quote from this poem some of the lines which have entered English vocabulary, English language. So as you can see that the following points can be seen in part 1, that it is a great fault to judge ill as to write ill, and a more dangerous one to the public. So the two functions, one is of writing and the other of judging the writing. These two functions are taken up by poets and critics. But the idea here is that writing badly is as dangerous as being a bad critic. The variety of men's tastes, of a true taste, how rare to be found. Now, taste was another term that gained importance in the 18th century. Taste suggested some kind of refinement in culture, and we speak of men of taste. It is men who are refined, cultured, and who have taste. So taste suggested some apprehension of literature and cultural nuances. So here Pope defines that it is very rare. He says that it is very rare to find true taste, and that there are many kinds of tastes among people. So everybody does not have the same taste in literature. That most men are born with some taste but spoiled by false education. The multitude of critics and causes of them. Why the number of critics is always much higher than that of poets. That we have to study our own taste and know the limits. Nature is the best guide of judgment, improved by art and rules, which are but methodized nature. Rules derived from the practice of the ancient poets, that therefore the ancients are necessary to be studied by a critic, particularly Homer and Virgil. Of licenses and the use of them by the ancients, reverence due to the ancients and praise of them. So in these points we also see the neoclassical doctrine which still followed the doctrine of imitation. the doctrine which was made popular in the Renaissance, that modern writers should imitate ancient writers. We find that that doctrine was followed by the neoclassical writers of the 17th century France and 18th century England. Then we have part 2 and part 3. So let us look at the poem. So one thing we see in this poem is that the concept of nature is very important, and nature vis-a-vis art. The debate between the comparative superiority, which has more superiority, whether nature or art. The seeds of that debate can be seen here. But in the 18th century, or from a neoclassical point of view, the idea of nature was quite stable. Nature was considered to be the source of truth, and art was only an imitation of nature. So the poem begins with the notion of criticism. So what is the role of criticism, or the role of a critic, and whether it is the writer or it is the critic who is more influential? That question is taken up at the very beginning. It is hard to say if greater want of skill appear in writing or in judging ill, but of the two, less dangerous is the offence to tire our patience than mislead our sense. Some few in that, but numbers are in this. 10 cents are wrong for one who writes amiss. So, a greater number of people mislead our sense. So, it is the critics who mislead our sense. The bad poet may tire our patience, but critics mislead us in understanding anything. So, few are the bad poets, but the number of bad critics are much more. So Pope said it is like 10:1. So 10 cents are wrong. So 10 critics make mistakes in their judgment, whereas one poet may write badly. A fool might want himself alone exposed. Now one in verse makes many more in prose. So if there were only one bad poet who exposed himself as a fool, now because of the fact that the number of critics is far greater, so we find 10 people writing badly in prose. It is with our judgments as our watches, none go just alike, yet each believes his own. So if you compare number of watches, every watch will give a different time. Similarly with our judgment. In poets as true genius is but rare, true taste as seldom is the critic's share. So the concept of genius was actually, the concept of individual genius was actually a product of the 19th century Romanticism. In the 18th century, the concept of genius still meant one who had achieved a lot, and the sense of, more than the sense of inspiration, the sense of effort was considered as of greater importance. True genius is rare, that is, a poet who would be accepted as, very great. So such poets are rare. In the 19th century and later interpretation, genius would mean original inspiration, but not in the 18th century, because it still followed the theory of imitation. So a poet was not supposed to be extremely original. On the other hand, he was supposed to imitate the classical writers. Therefore, genius here would mean one who would be a great poet. Both must alike from heaven derive their light, these born to judge as well as those to write. So genius is rare among poets, similarly, true taste is very rare among critics. So the idea of taste is important for the critic, because the critic is a judge, so he would apply his taste in judging. And Pope says that as genius is rare in a poet, so taste is rare in a critic. They both come from heaven. Let such teach others who themselves excel, and censor freely who have written well. Now this is the most difficult and impossible proposition, that only those who are themselves great poets, let them be critics. But as Pope would explain in course of the poem, that this does not happen. Great poets do not write criticism, and those who are critics, they mostly are failed poets. So those who cannot excel in writing poetry, they become critics. Nature affords at least a glimmering light. The lines though touched but faintly, are drawn bright. But as the slightest sketch, if justly traced, is by ill colouring but the more disgraced, so by false learning is good sense defaced. So, you see, the concept of nature is introduced very early in the poem. So, nature affords a glimmering light of what? Of truth. So, truth which is in the divine idea. So, the Platonic concept that only idea is truth, the idea in God's mind. So, nature provides some reflection of that, even though the lines are faintly drawn, but they are drawn right. But if a drawing, well done drawing, is colored poorly or badly, then it spoils the entire work. Similarly, poets who imitate nature and write poorly, they spoil the whole representation of this truth or this glimmering light. So by false learning is good sense defaced. So false learning is dangerous, and good sense defaced. Now we have this term good sense. In the 18th century, good sense, common sense, these terms became popular as it reflected the taste of the bourgeois middle class. Some are bewildered in the maze of schools, and some with coxcombs, nature made but fools. So some of the poets, some of the critics, they are puzzled by the readings, a lot of reading. If one cannot assimilate properly, then they are bewildered in the maze of schools. And others are made by nature to be fools. In search of wit, these lose their common sense and then turn critics in their own defense. So here you see the phrase common sense. Earlier you saw good sense. So these are the phrases made popular in the 18th century, and then turn critics in their own defense. So poets who fail in writing because of their lack of common sense, then they become critics, trying to defend themselves. Each burns alike who can or cannot write, all with rivals or an eunuch's spite. So who can is a poet. A poet burns, that is, suffers, because there would always be a rival poet. And a critic who cannot write, a critic burns as he is suffering the hatred of an eunuch. So a critic is compared to a eunuch because as a eunuch cannot reproduce, cannot give birth, so a critic is barren. Similarly, he cannot write poetry. So he suffers an eunuch's fate. All fools are still an itching to deride, and fame would be upon the laughing side. If Maevius scribble in Apollo's spite, there are who judge still worse than he can write. So critics, they behave like fools, and they are laughed at. Some have at first for wits, then poets pass, turned critics next, and proved plain fools at last. So these are the different stages in the trajectory of the career of a poetaster, that is, one who wants to be a poet. Ben Jonson ridiculed in his play Poetaster, he ridiculed one of the contemporary poets. So at first he would like to be called a wit, that is an intelligent gentleman. Then poets, then when he will fail as a poet, then he would turn a critic, and finally he would be proved to be a plain fool. So this is the career of a failed poet or critic who lacks judgment. Some neither can for wits nor critics pass, as heavy mules are neither horse nor ass. So we have here satirical statements about failed poets, bad poets or bad critics. So some do not even pass as wits or poets. That is the first two stages, they fail at the very beginning. So they are like mules who are neither horse nor ass. So one does not know their origin. Those half-learned witlings, numerous in our isle, as half-formed insects on the banks of Nile. Very humorous. So the popular belief was that insects are born when sunlight falls on the banks of Nile, on the mud of Nile. So the muds of Nile had this generative power. But half-formed insects, similarly half-learned witlings, many people can be found in England, our isle means England, who are only half-learned and who pretend to be wits. Unfinished things one knows not what to call. Their generation is so equivocal, ambiguous. So we do not know whether they may be called wits or they may be called poets or critics, because they are half-formed, half-learned, and very poorly developed. To tell them would 100 tongues require, or one vain wits that might 100 tire. Tell means count. So the number of such inefficient or bad poets is so great in our country that 100 tongues would be needed to describe them, or a vain wit who may tire 100 people. But you who seek to give and merit fame and justly bear a critic's noble name, be sure yourself and your own deeds to know how far your genius, taste and learning go. So from line 46 onwards, Pope gives the suggestions to a critic, one who wants to be a good critic. So up to line 45, he derided, bad critics as bad writers. So to be a good critic, one must have genius, taste and learning. And one must know one's own limits. Launch not beyond your depth, but be discreet, and mark that point where sense and dullness meet. So you should not cross your limit, and there will always come a point after which you will not be talking sense. Your speech will be foolish. So you mark that point where sense and dullness meet. Nature to all things fixes the limits fit, and wisely carved proud man's pretending wit. So man is by nature proud, but nature has limited man, limited everybody. So everybody has a limited power of intelligence, and therefore you should know your limit. As on the land, while here the ocean gains, in other parts it leaves wide sandy plains. So if we see the ocean gaining into land, encroaching upon land here, it will mean that water must be receding from another part where more land is being exposed. Similarly, if we see a lot of intelligent people here, that would mean that in another part of the world there would be a lot of foolish people. But most likely Pope would say that if we see that there are a lot of foolish people here in England, that would mean that there must be a number of intelligent people elsewhere. Thus in the soul, while memory prevails, the solid power of understanding fades. So we never have everything all together. So when in a person memory is stronger, then we will see that that person have less understanding. Where beams of warm imagination play, the memory's soft figures melt away. On the other hand, when we find a person to be very imaginative, then we find that he lacks memory. One science only will one genius fit, so vast is art, so narrow human wit. So a man's mind or man's brain has very limited capacity and can learn only one science or only one art. Each man can learn only one art properly, but science is vast or art is vast, but human wit is narrow. So this is kind of echo of Horace's saying, ars longa vita brevis, which means art is vast, long here means fast, but life is short. Here we have art is vast but human wit is narrow. Not only bounded to peculiar arts, but often those confined to single parts. So a poet can not only have the knowledge of only one art, but sometimes even a single part of an art. Like kings we lose the conquest gained before, by vain ambition still to make them more. Each mighty several province well command, would all but stoop to what they understand. So it is futile for man to attempt to conquer more domains of knowledge, because man can specialize in his life in only one discipline, because life is short, and thus he is like an ambitious conqueror or an ambitious king who lose the conquest the countries that he had earlier gained because of his vain ambition. Now comes some important lines which I have highlighted. First follow nature and your judgment frame by her just standard, which is still the same. Unerring nature still divinely bright, one clear, unchanged and universal light, life, force and beauty must to all infer, at once the source and end and taste of art. So here we see the doctrine that nature is superior to art. So first follow nature. So an artist must imitate nature, and the judgment of a critic must be framed by the standard of nature, because the standard is always the same in nature. Unerring nature, still divinely bright. So here we have that Platonic idea that nature represents the unerring, divinely bright, universal light, that is the light of truth coming from God. One clear, unchanged and universal light, and therefore in nature one can see life, force, beauty, everything imparted, and nature is the source, end and taste of art. So in these lines Pope formulates the doctrine, the neoclassical doctrine, that nature is of prior importance and art should follow nature. Art from that fund, each just supply provides, works without show and without form besides. So the fund or the source is nature, from which art supplies some material and works without show or without form. In some fair body does the informing soul with spirit speeds, with vigors fills the whole, each motion guides and every nerve sustains. Itself unseen but in the effects remains. You see here the Platonic doctrine that a human body in which the soul enters and feeds it spiritually. So the strength of the body, the movement of the body and every nerve, all the works of the body are guided by the soul. But the soul itself remains unseen, only the effects can be seen. There are whom heavens has blessed with store of wit, yet want as much again to manage it. For wit and judgment ever are at strife, to mend each other's aid like man and wife. Here wit means imagination. So Pope says that imagination and judgment, these two are always fighting. These two are always fighting each other. So a poet uses imagination and a critic uses judgment. But we rarely see both judgment and imagination in a single person. So a poet has imagination but lacks judgment. A critic has judgment but lacks imagination or wit. So they are like man and wife, even though they must always come together or be together, yet they must always fight. It is more to guide than spur the muse's steed, restrain his fury and provoke his speed. So judgment falters, judgment which is supposed to spur the muse's steed, that is, which is supposed to help or aid imagination, instead of helping imagination, it restrains his fury, that is, stops imagination rather than provoking his speed. Okay. The winged courser, like a generous horse, shows most true mettle when you check his course. So the poet shows his true quality when his flight of imagination is checked by the rules of writing, by judgment. So here is an allusion to Pegasus, the winged horse. Pegasus was supposed to be the horse of the muses, who carried the muses in a flight far into the sky. So the imagination wants to fly like Pegasus, but its course is checked by judgment. The lines in the third bracket, these are written by me, kind of commentary. So here we see the Platonic concept of inspiration. So the judgment which helps a poet or a critic, and the inspiration of the imagination which tries to express itself, they work together. Those rules of old discovered, not devised, are nature still, but nature methodized. So these lines are also very famous. So I might as well highlight these two lines. So the rules of writing have been discovered from nature only. They are not devised, that is, they are not created by man. Why? Because these rules have also been taken from nature, but they have been methodized, and that is what makes them artificial or makes them rules. But it is nature methodized. Nature, like monarchy, is but restrained by the same laws which first herself ordained. So as a monarch who cannot be ruled by anybody, devises rules by which the monarch himself decides to be ruled. So monarchy is restrained by the laws which she herself devised. Similarly, nature or inspiration is controlled by the rules of writing which are devised from nature itself. Here how learned Greeks have useful rules in guides, when to repress and when indulge or flights. High on Parnassus' top at suns she soared, and pointed out those arduous paths they trod, held from afar aloft the immortal prize, and urged the rest by equal steps to rise. So, since Greece was considered to be the mother of poetry for European poets during the Renaissance, when they discovered Greek and Roman writing, they took Greek poetry, Greek art to be the source of all their art. So here Pope imagines that the muse standing on the top of Parnassus, the Mount Parnassus, she showed her sons, that is the Greek poets, the useful rules and how to control imagination, when to repress, when indulge. So imagination must be allowed to run free, at the same time at some point it must be checked. And thus the muse showed the arduous paths of the poets and held the immortal prize to them and urged the rest by equal steps to rise. So one must rise gradually. One cannot reach the top of Mount Parnassus at a go. Similarly, one cannot write good poetry on the spot. So there must be a lot of effort, arduous effort undertaken before one can write good poetry. So here you see the difference between classical or neoclassical idea of art and the romantic idea. So in classical and neoclassical idea, effort or training is attached a lot of importance. But in romantic idea, it is believed that inspiration is everything. Just precepts thus from great examples given, she drew from them what they derived from heaven. So precepts of criticism were derived from what the poets got from heaven. So the poets got their inspiration from heaven, and from their works the laws of criticism were derived. The generous critic fanned the poet's fire and taught the world with reason to admire. Now notice here, Pope uses the phrase the generous critic, suggesting that originally a critic was generous who helped the poet writing by telling the world how to admire him. So the underlying suggestion here is that today we lack a generous critic, a critic who would help a poet, who would prepare the audience for such a poet. On the other hand, we have critics who think that it is their task to speak badly of the poet. So in this stanza or in these lines we see the idea that roots of art are derived from nature. Then criticism, the muse's handmaid proved, to grace her charms and make her more beloved. but following which from that intention straight, who could not win the mistress, would the maid. Very interesting formulation. So criticism was the handmaid of the muses. That is, criticism is 1 degree below poetry, and criticism is supposed to help poetry, to make her more beloved. A critic is supposed to prepare the readers, prepare the audience for poetry. But following which from that intention straight, would not win the mistress, would the maid. So poets of our time, which they strayed from this purpose, this intention, they could not win the maid, that is, they could not win the mistress, that is, they could not be successful as poets, they could not write poetry, so they would the maid. They became critics, because criticism is the handmaid of poetry. So those who failed to be poets, they became critics. Critics are poets manqué or failed poets. Against the poets their own arms they turned, sure to hate most the men from whom they learned. So they turned against the poets. So modern apothecaries taught the art by doctors' bills to play the doctor's part, bold in the practice of mistaken rules, prescribe, apply and call their masters fools. Apothecary, A is elided here. So apothecary means one who runs a medicine shop. One who runs a medicine shop. He reads the doctor's prescriptions, and learning from those prescriptions the medicines for different diseases, he starts playing the doctor. So even today we see that if you go to the medicine shop and tell the people that you have these certain problems, certain symptoms, then they would prescribe you, suggest which medicines you should buy. So they are not doctors, but they begin to hate doctors from whom they have learned. Prescribe, apply and call their masters fools. So these men develop a jealousy for the doctors and call them fools. Some on the lips of ancient authors pray, nor time nor moss ever spoiled so much as they. So here some poets or critics, they have been compared to moths. As moths eat ancient manuscripts or pages of books, leaves of books of ancient authors. Similarly, these critics, they plagiarize from ancient poets. Some dryly plain without invention's aid, dry critics without, some dryly plain without invention's aid, write dull receipts how poems may be made. So some critics, they are very dry, they do not have any power of imagination or invention, and they write dull prescriptions about how poems could be written. So here we see that Pope is criticizing the critic, which reminds me of an essay by T.S. Eliot, to criticize the critic. So he is criticizing bad critics. And in this poem, which is called an essay on criticism, he is suggesting how should one write good criticism or good theory. These lose the sense they are learning to display. Some critics write and those explain the meaning quite away. These critics, they only try to display their learning and try to explain the meaning of their poetry, which is not the job of poet. You then, whose judgment the right course would steer, know well each ancient's proper character. So whenever Pope addresses the reader as you in an apostrophe, then he is assuming that he is speaking to an would-be critic. So how to be a good critic? That is what he is suggesting here. So in order to run the judgment on the right course, one must know well the proper character of each ancient writer. His fable, subject, scope in every page, religion, country, genius of his age. So a good critic must read all the works of ancient poets and know the religion, country, genius, that is the socio-historical context of these poets. Without all these at once before your eyes, cavil you may but never criticize. So in order to be good critic, you must have all this knowledge. Otherwise, it will not be criticism, only cavil. That is a careless remark. The Homer's works you study and delight. Read them by day and meditate by night. So, if this is the task of a critic, then it means hard work. Pope says that you must read the works of Homer by day and by night. You must think about it. You must derive delight from his poetry and learn from it. And by reading Homer, form your judgment, sense your notions bring, and trace the muses upward to their spring. So, the muses reside on the top of Mount Parnassus, and from there the river of inspiration flows and goes below the spring of Helicon at the foot of the mount. So if you want to trace the source of this inspiration, you must go upstream and read Homer and learn from him, and then you form your judgment and understand how rules of writing are fused with inspiration. Still with itself compared, his text peruse, or let your comment be the Mantuan muse. Mantuan muse is Virgil. So Virgil learned about poetry by reading Homer, and he imitated Homer, and his concepts were derived from Homer. So you should behave like that. When first young Maro sang of kings and wars, ever warning Phoebus touched his trembling ears. Perhaps he seemed above the critic's law, and but from nature's fountain scorned to draw. Maro is Virgil. So when young Virgil began to write about kings and wars, that is the Aeneid, ever warning Phoebus touched his trembling ears. Phoebus is the sun. So he would wake up very early in the morning, and it would seem that he was above the critic's law and did not want to draw from nature's fountain. But when to examine every part he came, nature and Homer were he found the same. It is said that Virgil first intended to write a poem on the Alban and Roman affairs, which he found beyond his powers, and then he imitated Homer. So I have given you the notes here from copying them from another site. So Virgil initially thought that he would write about kings and wars. We can see that it is a different world that Pope is alluding to, not the Aeneid. But then he found it to be beyond his powers, and he did not want to draw from nature's fountain. That is, initially he thought that he would be able to write it himself, but then he came to read Homer, and examining every part, he found that Homer and nature were the same. Convinced, amazed, he checked the bold design, and rules as strict his labored work confined. as if the Stagirites overlooked each line. So when Virgil saw that Homer followed nature very closely, then he drew instructions or lessons, derived lessons from Homer's writings and wrote in that manner, and as if Aristotle himself examined over his writing and passed them. Stagirite means Aristotle, which means that he wrote correctly and properly when he tried to imitate Homer. Learn hence for ancient rules just esteem. To copy nature is to copy them. Therefore, the message is that if you want to copy nature, you copy the ancient authors. So here we find the theory of imitation. So if Virgil imitated well by copying Homer, and then he found that Homer copied nature. Therefore, by copying Homer, Virgil was able to copy nature. So that is what every poet should do, that he should copy an ancient. And then in the next few lines, Pope suggests the idea that though there are rules in writing, great poets may sometimes flout the rules of writing. Okay. So we will look at these lines, but here I will take a 2 minutes break. If you have any questions till now, what has been taught till now, you can ask me.